There is a particular kind of power that
stop.
does not require anyone to be afraid of you. It requires instead that everyone needs you. Meyer Lansky understood this distinction earlier than almost anyone in his world, and he spent 60 years exploiting it with a precision that made the distinction itself invisible to most of the people who depended on him. The men who ran the American underworld in the middle decades of the 20th century, the bosses of the New York families, the leadership of the Chicago outfit, the operators in Kansas City and New Orleans and Miami,
urgent. What are
were
our
powerful
options?
in the traditional
We must
sense.
consider the risks.
They controlled territory.
Indeed.
Here are the
They enforced
finalized ledgers
compliance
for
through
United
violence.
Trading. Q3 expenses are
They were
reviewed,
feared,
with
which is a
commissions
form of
applied.
power, though a brittle one, because
numbers
fear
don't
requires
stop.
constant maintenance and creates constant enemies.
Gentlemen,
Lansky
the
was something
situation is
else.
critical. I agree.
He
We
was
must
needed.
act.
The
Precisely.
difference
What are
between
the
being
figures?
feared and
Here are the
being
estimates.
needed
We
is
can't
the difference
ignore
between
this.
a creditor and a
I know.
debtor. A man
But
who
we
is
must be
feared can be
careful.
replaced by someone more frightening or by a coalition willing to absorb the cost of removing him. A man who is needed cannot be replaced until someone else learns to do what he does. And what Lansky did. Managing the financial architecture of organizations that generated criminal revenue at a scale that legitimate systems could not absorb was, by the 1940s and 1950s, something that no one else in the American underworld knew how to do at his level. This made him, functionally, the banker of the American mob. The term is not merely metaphorical. Lansky did for the major organized crime organizations of mid-century America what banks do for legitimate businesses. He received their revenues, managed their assets, moved their money across jurisdictions in ways that minimized legal exposure and returned to them funds that were, if not legally clean, at least legally unattributable. He charged for this service. Not in cash, not in any documented way, but in the form of a share of the returns generated by the system he operated and in the form of relationships that gave him standing and protection across the entire landscape of American organized crime. The economics of this arrangement were, from Lansky's perspective, close to optimal. He generated income without generating the kind of visible criminal activity that law enforcement could document. He accumulated power without accumulating the kind of enemies that visible power tends to create. And he built a position that was in many respects more secure than that of any of the bosses he served. Because the bosses came and went through death and imprisonment and internal displacement, while the financial system Lansky managed continued to function regardless of who was currently sitting at the head of which table. Every major organized crime organization faced the same fundamental problem, the gap between the cash they generated and the assets they could safely hold. Cash is dangerous. It attracts attention, it is difficult to invest, it is vulnerable to seizure. The ability to convert criminal cash into something less visible, less traceable, and more legally defensible was worth a significant premium. Lansky provided that ability at a level of sophistication no one else could match. And he had been providing it long enough that it had become, for the organizations that depended on it, not a luxury but a necessity. Something so embedded in their financial structure that removing it would have been as disruptive as removing the banking system from a legitimate economy. The New York families were the largest and most complex clients. 5 separate organizations, each generating cash through gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering, each needing that cash to move out of the visible economy into a form that could not be traced back to its criminal origin. Lansky managed this not as a single consolidated operation, but as a series of separate relationships structured so that the full picture was visible only to him. The consigliere of one family did not know the details of the arrangements Lansky had with another family. The Chicago leadership did not know the specifics of how Lansky was managing New York's money. This deliberate compartmentalization ensured that his position was irreplaceable, because replacing him would have required reconstructing not just his methods, but the dozens of separate relationships through which those methods operated. The skim system that ran through the Las Vegas casinos was, in its design, essentially a Lansky creation. And it required one thing above all else: trust. None of the parties receiving funds through the casino skim had any legal mechanism for verifying their correct share. They relied entirely on Lansky's integrity, which was reliable in the specific and interesting sense that he gave everyone what they were owed and kept for himself only what he was entitled to. This reliability was itself a form of power. In a world where trust was scarce and verification was impossible, the man who was trusted by everyone was functionally the most powerful person in the room. Not because anyone was afraid of him, because everyone needed him to be honest, and he was. The New Orleans operation, long under the direction of Carlos Marcello, illuminated another dimension of what the banking relationship meant. Marcello controlled a vast network across Louisiana and beyond. The revenues that network generated required exactly the kind of management Lansky provided. Access to Lansky's offshore network meant access to a level of financial invisibility that no local arrangement could provide. The relationship gave Marcello's organization a financial security that the most sophisticated law enforcement pursuit could not penetrate. This was worth, in operational terms, more than almost anything else Lansky could have offered. The protection that Lansky's position afforded him was not the protection of physical force. He had none of his own. It was the protection of indispensability. The major organized crime organizations of mid-century America could not harm him without harming themselves, could not expose him without exposing themselves, could not replace him because no replacement existed. The banker of the American mob was, by virtue of being the banker, the one person in the entire structure who did not need to worry about what any of the other people in the structure might decide to do to him. There was also a dimension of this arrangement that had no precedent in American crime, the cross-ethnic structure of the banking relationship. Lansky was Jewish, and the organizations he primarily served were Italian-American. In the ethnic landscape of organized crime, this would have been unusual in almost any other context, but Lansky occupied a position that transcended ethnic categories because his function was genuinely useful to everyone, and because he had been performing it since the early 1930s before the ethnic boundaries had fully hardened. His relationship with Lucky Luciano, dating to the Prohibition era, gave him a standing within the Italian-American organized crime world that no other Jewish figure possessed. He was not merely tolerated, he was indispensable, and the indispensability had been demonstrated over so many years and so many transactions that it had become a structural feature of the organizations that depended on it. When Bugsy Siegel was killed in 1947, the Las Vegas casino project continued under different management. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, the financial relationships he had helped establish continued through institutional memory. When individual bosses were imprisoned or displaced, their successors inherited their relationship with the financial system Lansky managed. He had not built personal relationships that depended on specific individuals remaining in power. He had built an institutional infrastructure that survived the individuals. The banker outlasted the clients. The system outlasted the bosses. By the early 1970s, federal investigators confronted a peculiar problem. The system was thoroughly documented in their files, and completely undocumented in any form that a court could use. The financial system Lansky had operated for decades was, in one sense, visible everywhere. In investigative files, wiretap transcripts, the testimony of dozens of witnesses who understood pieces of it without understanding the whole. And in another sense, completely undocumented, because the documentation necessary to prosecute it was precisely what Lansky had spent his entire career ensuring did not exist. The banker of the American mob had kept his books in his head, and the books were finally the most secure form of storage available to him, because you cannot subpoena a memory, and you cannot introduce a recollection as evidence, and when the man who remembers everything chooses to remember nothing useful, the entire legal apparatus of the most powerful government in the world arrives, finally, at the same place it always arrived with Meyer Lansky. An empty ledger, a complete man, and no way to connect the two.